problem with owning real estate is that the real estate winds up owning you. And people forget maintenance costs can be high, taxes are unpredictable, and you're illiquid in the meantime. But in BA, I think the total costs, barring extraordinary events like fixing the roof on the building, because it's an old French-style building and the maintenance has to be done. I don't think it costs more than a couple $1,000s per year. Yep. My favorite country that no longer exists is Rhodesia. And I went there during the war. It was a fine adventure, and it was an adventure, but at that time, it really was. Everything from landing at the airport in Salisbury, which is now called Harare, you had to pull down the window shades because they were afraid of rockets being launched at the landing planes and so forth. I mean, it was like that all over Rhodesia. When I went to Rhodesia, as I always do when I go to a new country, and it was new to me then, I always call up the real estate agents and the lawyers because they're centers of information, centers of power, money, good people to get to know. There, I also got in touch with a local publisher because my first book, The International Man, had just come out. And I thought this would be a perfect country for a book that tells you how to make the most of your personal freedom and financial opportunity around the world. Because in Rhodesia at that time, there were 250,000 Europeans and about 3 million Native Africans. Now, there's about maybe 5,000 Europeans and about 13, 14 million Native Africans. So because people have been making what they call the chicken run. In any event, interviewed a couple of publishers, got along well with one of them, and my book became the largest selling book in the history of Rhodesia, a record never to be broken. But I think that over the next couple of decades, a lot of countries that currently exist will be broken up through secession, no question about it. In fact, most of the countries in the world aren't real countries at all. For instance, in South America, where I spend most of the year, I think Brazil will turn into 2 or 3 countries in the future. You go to southern Brazil, Sao Paulo and south of Rio, and it's very European. But you go to the north, it's almost African. The two places don't mix. I mean, they say that Brazil has the best racial mixing pot in the world, and it's probably true. But still, it doesn't mix that well. The beaches are better up around Fortaleza, but it's cheaper. But I think you're better off, and not as cheap as Argentina, but Argentina is the bargain basement in South America. I think I'm accurate in saying that because things change all the time. But there are a bunch of other countries that could break up. I mean, Chile break up into 2 countries with the far south actually turning into an Indian republic because they still have problems. In fact, this is true through a number of countries in Latin America. The native Indians are still resentful of the conquistadores and want to get rid of them. I mean, Bolivia, for instance, should break up into at least 2 or 3 countries, and it probably will. True of Chile, Ecuador, same problems. Of course, Indonesia is an artificially constructed. It's actually the Javanese empire where they actually created an artificial language so they could all communicate with each other. But I don't think Indonesia is going to last either as one country. Whenever a central government is in control, they want to stay in control. They don't want to see secession movements. Not a bit. Maybe the last one this happened with was Sudan. So it should happen in the Congo. That's another one where there's another war going on. People don't realize that over the last 20 years, nobody knows, 5-6 million people have been killed in the Congo. Well, Europe is on the slippery slope. There's no question about that in my mind. For instance, people forget that Italy only became Italy as a country. There was a whole bunch of little dukedoms and principalities. Same thing for Germany, which only became Germany in like 1870 or thereabouts under Bismarck. Spain, the Basque region, Catalonia should break off from it. From my point of view, or the point of view I think of any freedom lover, we'd like to see as many countries in the world as possible, all friendly, easy to travel between. Anyway, the world is going to be changing very, very rapidly over this next decade. I don't think it's going to be particularly pleasant or convenient, which is another advantage, incidentally, to living here in Southeast Asia, which is a little bit out of the line of fire between East and West. But especially, I think Argentina and Uruguay are very much out of the line of fire. Talk about racism, which has been made into an artificially big deal in the U.S. People in these Asian countries are racist towards each other. Even if a Guaylo, to use the Chinese word for a foreigner, can't tell the difference between them looking at them, they can. And I'm not a fan of racism, but it's endemic all over the world. In fact, I think the most racist continent is probably Africa. What? How can that be? They're all black people. Well, because of the tribes, right? 500,000 people or so, nobody knows, hacked to death with machetes. But it's gone back to being stable now. So these things are, if I wasn't living mostly in Argentina and Uruguay, which are very similar to each other, I might have wound up in Thailand, which is in many ways the most mellow country to live in the world. You'll never become a Thai citizen. You'll never become one of them. It just doesn't work that way. But a great place to live. A young Chicano in Los Angeles has about zero in common with an old white female retiree in Massachusetts. And at some point, he's going to become very resentful about paying for her Social Security. So, yeah, I think the U.S. could break up because over the last, has it only been 15 or 20 years, the U.S. has divided itself into red people and blue people. And it's amazing that people that have woke blue thoughts running through their mind, they can't talk to the red people, which is, the heartland, middle America, traditional values at all. In fact, they've come to hate each other. And this has been crystallized with Donald Trump running for president, and oddly enough, against Kamala. And I'm not sure how she pronounces her name correctly. She had her stepdaughters giving people at the Democratic convention, you might recall, lectures on the correct pronunciation of her name. But actually, neither of them are correct. It should be pronounced Kamala, which means in Spanish, how bad. So maybe the U.S., since it's increasingly Spanish-speaking, will adopt particular Spanish cognate pronunciation of her name. If Trump wins, he's not going to be as bad as Kamala. The good thing about Trump is that he's a cultural traditionalist. Regardless of what stupid ideas he has about economics, and he has plenty of dumb ideas about economics, notwithstanding the fact that he's a businessman, which is good, and Kamala is not. But the thing is, Donald does not want to overturn the basic essence, the basic nature of America. It's the only way he's a real conservative, but it's in a very important way. The people that control the government now are all Jacobins. They're the same personality types that ran the French Revolution in 1789. Same way of thinking, same philosophy, same thoughts. And they're pretty entrenched. They've entrenched themselves further with people they've hired and are now protected by civil service. And if Kamala wins, they'll stay in office. In fact, I think she is going to win. The United States has become increasingly politicized, and it has. Every election is more important than the one before it, because one thing that people forget about is that from, let's say, a bit over 100 years ago, just before World War I, which was a major turning point in the U.S., as you know, in 1913, that was the year when the income tax was initialized in the U.S., temporarily, of course, and very small, trivial, starting at a very high number, like $10,000 or $20,000, which like $250,000 or whatever. And the other thing, of course, was the inception of the Federal Reserve, which is one of the major influences towards destroying the country. In any event, back in those days, did it really make much difference who was the president? Well, no, because the government was not an overweening feature. Most people didn't care that the government was there. It supported itself strictly on excise taxes and import duties. But today, it digs into every part of the U.S., takes, who knows, you can't really trust the government's figures, not much more than you can those of Argentina anyway. But I'm afraid as the government in Washington has turned into an entity unto itself, fighting pointless foreign wars, dangerous foreign wars everywhere for no good reason, it's become the greatest danger to your personal freedom and your personal finances. It's not the Chinese government I worry about. It's not the Iranian government I worry about. They've never done any wrong to me. But the U.S. government is a clear and present danger. Switzerland, if you have a lot of money, is a place to consider living, but the Swiss are very particular about who was granted a residence permit. And there are a few other enclaves in Europe, like Andorra, which most people don't even know is a country, but it's a little bit isolated. But generally speaking, I would forget about Europe, frankly. And if we actually have World War III and it goes nuclear, I hate to say it, but it's possible. At this point, Europe's not going to be the best place to be. I don't think there's any place in Africa, which I think is a good place for a young man still. Where would I go if I wanted to stick my foot in the water in Africa? I think the first country that I would visit would be Namibia. low population, giant geographic area. I'd say Namibia, Botswana, the most prosperous country in Africa, probably. But I like obscure places where if you're a white European or North American, where you're unusual. A level playing field is a nice ideal. But when I'm playing the game, I like to be on the high ground. I like an unlevel playing field where I have more money, more expertise, more knowledge than the locals do. That means it's a good arbitrage. Good for them, because I can bring something valuable to the party, and good for me, because I can bring something to the party. If you want to do it, if you want to internationalize, it's the 11th hour. In fact, it's the 11th hour and 50th minute. Because one thing that people have to remember is that the government never controls itself, but it does control its subjects, who are called citizens for some reason. And one of the ways they'll do this is going to be with foreign exchange controls, which make it very hard and inconvenient and costly to move your money out of the country. So if you're a fairly well-to-do American, now is the time to get your money out of the country and establish a second residence, preferably with a second citizenship, someplace else. Now, in the United States, academia is totally conquered by the cultural Marxists. It was not that way when I went to college, and I don't recommend people go to college today, incidentally. I'll just toss that out there. In fact, I'm in process of writing another book as to what exactly should a young person do in that important 4 years when most people go to college and tie an albatross of a lot of debt around their necks. Much more important things to learn and not be corrupted, which is almost certain to happen. Listening behind your desk to all kinds of idiots talking, and almost all college professors at this point are hardcore leftists. The entertainment industry, totally captured by leftists, insinuating wrong ideas. U.S. corporations, international corporations, totally captured. Heads of corporations are all members of the WEF, World Economic Forum. When the bad guys have control of the apparatus of the state, it's hard to evict them, even if they have to cheat. The Russians are painted the bad guys everywhere, okay? And historically, during the Soviet days, they were the bad guys. But things have changed, and Putin isn't a good guy, but you can't be the head of a giant militarized state like that and be a good guy. But when it comes to comparing to him to any other world leader today, he's better educated, he's more thoughtful, he's less inclined to war, notwithstanding this thing in the Ukraine where he was provoked and prodded into invading the place. It was a mistake for him to do that, but Russia and Putin get a bad rap. And of course, the U.S. has what? We don't know. They probably don't even know themselves. About 800 bases around the world outside the U.S. That's an insane number. That's the kind of thing an empire does. And of course, I describe the U.S. now as a multicultural domestic empire. It's not the country it was even 50 years ago. We weren't multicultural, and we didn't have a domestic empire, although we were, since the days of Teddy Roosevelt or McKinley approximately, we've been building an international empire, mostly a commercial empire, a financial empire, controlling these countries that way and with quietly through the CIA and the State Department. And there's not going to be a BRICS currency because they don't trust each other. There's a reason why they should. And they just have paper fiat currencies since the whole world uses the dollar as the international currency, which is insane because the major export of the U.S. since about 1980 hasn't been Boeings or soybeans or whatever. It's been dollars. We've been running this gigantic payments deficits where we pay for Mercedes and Toyotas and whatever and cocaine with dollars that are printed up in Washington, of which there are 10 scores of trillions in the hands of foreigners right now. They're like a time bomb because foreigners don't have to use dollars the way Americans do. And the dollar rests on nothing but confidence. And when confidence blows away like a pile of feathers in a hurricane, those dollars are all going to come back to the U.S. with catastrophic results. So they want to get rid of dollars. So what's going to happen? They're going to go back to gold, whether they like it or not. It's happening now. This is, in my opinion, why gold has been going up, up, up. And Bitcoin is going higher too. I think they're both viable assets. And especially as the world becomes more digitized and more computerized, if you would, things like Bitcoin inevitably will have a bigger role. Like all these governments are trying to impose central bank digital currencies on their subjects, which is very dangerous because when they control the money, And it's all in a computer. You don't own anything. I'm sorry to say, but the U.S. isn't always going to be on top. They have a disclosed deficit of $35 trillion, which just within our own lifetimes has gone up from hundreds of billions to 35 trillion. I mean, this is unsustainable. And everybody can see that this is happening. They can see that the U.S. government is like a poker player in a casino that's on tilt. It's been losing, he's been bleeding, and he's starting to make irrational, stupid bets trying to get out even. And that's what's happening with the U.S. It's gotten too big and too corrupt, and the management of the country has gotten too stupid. I hate to say it, but the U.S. is on the way out. America is a totally unique concept. It's not just a country, but unfortunately, America has been being washed away, and it's being replaced by the United States, run out of Washington, D.C., and that's why we're on the slippery slope, where everything is by and for and through the U.S. government. So yeah, of course it's going to go downhill. It could start out with a financial collapse where the markets, stock market, bond market, pumped up with a lot of funny money from the Federal Reserve. That could collapse. The economy has been built on a foundation of sand, in many ways, over-regulated assets, paper dollars. The economy collapsed so that Americans don't really have anything in common with each other anymore. If I was a young Nigerian, I'd want to get the hell out of there and come to America. For one thing, if you're one of the millions and millions of migrants walking across the Rio Grande, you get free food, free money, free housing. These people are being invited and subsidized to come to the U.S. So of course, if I was from a third world country, I'd want to get to the U.S. lickety-split. But that's not good for America, because when migrants came to the U.S. up until, say, 1950, they might have been penniless, but they shared the values of the U.S. and they weren't subsidized to come here.
Yeah.
And now these people are being subsidized to come here, which means instead of drawing the best and brightest people, which was the past, you're drawing the poorest and worst people who are looking for a freebie, something for nothing. It's actually insane.